So I'm talking about elasticity here, and elasticity is actually just a measurement of a behavioral response. It's something that economists use a lot when we're measuring things and when we're talking about our models. So I'm going to try to explain with a few examples what it is. And how you calculate elasticity is it's the percent change in the dependent variable divided by the percent change in the independent variable. So if we're thinking about a behavioral response, there has to be an independent variable that's influencing something and a dependent variable that's being influenced. So for example, and you'll a lot of times hear economists say things like the elasticity of voters, number of voters with respect to campaign dollars. And what that means is whatever's in this position here, this first position, that's going to be the dependent variable. So that's the variable being influenced by the other variable, and the other variable is at the end of this phrase, and that's the independent variable. And that's true for all of these formats. So elasticity of voters with respect to campaign dollars, that means when you invest in campaign dollars, you're doing that to influence the voters. And the elasticity is going to measure two things. It's going to measure, one is the magnitude, so how much, how big is this behavioral response? So magnitude is one of the key parts of an elasticity, and the other is going to be direction. Is it a positive or a negative relationship? So those are the two key pieces of elasticity. And if the elasticity of voters with respect to campaign dollars, if that is negative, or if that's positive, that means if we increase the campaign dollars, we're going to increase the number of voters, which is probably the case here. If those two go in the opposite direction, then the direction is going to be negative. So the two things that you want to describe about the relationship between two variables is when one variable goes up, does the other one go up or down? That's direction. And how much does it go up or down in response? So for example, the second example up here is the elasticity of bad words that a kid says with respect to the timeouts that a parent gives that child. And this one you can actually imagine going both directions. You could imagine the parent increases the timeouts and the number of bad words decreases. That's sort of the intention of the parent. So the parent hopes that this elasticity is negative in its direction. The parent also hopes that it has a very big magnitude. So it hopes that if you increase timeouts just a little bit, then the number of bad words a child says will decrease dramatically. That's the parent's hope about the elasticity. The parent might have a couple of fears though. They might fear that the magnitude of that is really small. So they might increase timeouts a little bit or a lot and only get a small decrease in the number of bad words the kid says. So the parent might fear that their independent variable, how they're trying to influence their child, doesn't have a very big behavioral response from their child. That would be one fear. And the other fear is an even worse fear. That would be, what if there's a positive relationship here? So what if the parent increases the number of timeouts and the child responds to that by increasing the number of bad words they say? Maybe it's a passive-aggressive mood or something like that. So elasticity, it's a measure that will help us tell the difference between those. So if we look at a bunch of examples of elasticities down here, negative 0.1, 0 to 0.05, negative 10, these are all measures of elasticities, and we notice that all of them have a direction, so they're all either positive or negative or zero. So here we have 2 positive elasticities and 3 negative elasticities. And we've got really different types of negative elasticities. This one's really big. So this one says the behavioral response is really big. This one says there is a negative relationship, but the behavioral response is really small. So this would be the one that the parent hopes is going to happen, the elasticity of bad words with respect to timeouts. But it's also possible that you increase the timeouts and don't get a very big response in terms of how many bad words the kid says. Or it's possible that there's a positive elasticity here, that there's a positive relationship between those two. And this is just a way that economists can describe that behavioral response. So let's look at a couple of others. Elasticity of cigarettes purchased with respect to the price of cigarettes. And this is actually an elasticity of demand. Economists love supply and demand so much that we had to give the elasticity of demand its own name, which is just elasticity of quantity purchased with respect to price. Anytime you have that format where quantity is the dependent, price is the independent, that's an elasticity of demand, and that's why it has its own name. And this one we might imagine is the direction of almost all elasticity of demands is going to be negative. You increase the price, people will buy fewer of the product. That's fairly intuitive. The question is, how big is the magnitude of this negative relationship? And with cigarettes, since they're addictive, you might think that if you increase the price of cigarettes a lot, you're not going to have a big decrease in the number of cigarettes purchased just because people purchasing them are addicted. So this one's probably going to be a negative elasticity with a very small magnitude. So this one's probably more like this elasticity over here, negative 0.01. Here we have elasticity of marriages with respect to the price of a marriage license. So the first thing you always figure out is what is the direction here. If you increase the price of a marriage license, the question is, will marriages increase or decrease? And if anything, they would decrease, but quite honestly, most people do not take into account the price of a marriage license when they decide whether or not to get married. That's probably because the price is fairly low in most states, so you could increase that price by 10%, 20%, maybe 100%, and you're probably not going to have a big change in marriages. So this elasticity is probably going to be very close to zero. It's a behavioral response with a potential to have a change in the number of marriages, but given the circumstances, we don't actually expect much behavioral change. So this one probably has an elasticity of 0. The bottom one here, elasticity of Vikings football fans, with respect to the dollars that we as the government spend on creating their stadium. So you might expect if we spend more money creating a higher quality stadium for the Vikings, you would expect an increase in the number of Vikings fans. So we expect this to be a positive relationship. How big is this relationship? Is it a really big relationship that we'll get lots more fans if we have a much higher quality stadium, or is it a small relationship that most people are going to choose whether or not they're Vikings fans based on things other than the quality of the stadium? Well, I don't know the answer. Someone would have to go out and measure that. And that's really what economists do with elasticity, is we come up with elasticity behavioral responses that matter to us, and then we build a model about those, and then we go out there and we measure them. So that's an overview of what elasticity is. And it's always, just to remind you one last time, it's a measurement, the percent change in the dependent variable divided by the percent change in the independent variable. That's mathematically how we calculate it.